What happens when a beautiful heiress falls in love with a man who everybody in retrospect agrees was pretty much a slime bag? In Jane Ward's case, she ends up dead from a grotesquely botched abortion. So this is Christina from the Sisyphean Journal. Today's October 27th, and I am just going to have to wing it on the death of Jane Ward because when I was updating it, I found way more information than I could possibly process in time to have everything up. So Jane met her Latin lover, Eduardo Schneiderwind, who spoke with a German accent but was actually Argentine, at a really upscale beach club where her parents had a cabana. They later started hanging out together in cocktail parties. Eduardo brought a ton of money from Argentina with him. He was living in an upscale hotel suite, to which he took Jane for some romantic trysts. Now, first of all, let me show you the metric buttload of stuff I have. Look at all of these articles. And of course, that beautiful photo of Jane. In addition, I went on Google Books and looked for her, and I found hundreds of pages of Dr. Paul Singer's appeal, which revealed even more information about the case. So I'm just going to kind of give you a real quick rundown of what happened and where I am with it. Basically, Jane met Eduardo in March of 1947 at the Atlantic Beach Club. The relationship turned intimate in about May. In July, Jane tells Eduardo that she thinks she's pregnant. Now, her friends indicate that it was kind of a given that they were a couple and would probably eventually marry. And they say that Jane pretty much seemed to expect that Eduardo was eventually going to marry her. Her pregnancy was not verified until late September of 1947. So, Jane wasn't in any particular hurry to deal with this, which seems to indicate that she was wanting Eduardo to marry her. Now, after Eduardo finds out that Jane's pregnant, he happens to run into Alejandro Ovalle, a Chilean who presents himself as a doctor, but later on turns out to not be a doctor. Eduardo met this guy because, as foreigners do, you tend to hang out with other foreigners quite a bit so that you're getting a feel for home. So there was kind of a South American expats community where they met. So because he believed Ovalle was a doctor, Eduardo said that Jane was pregnant and he needed to deal with it. Now, Ovalle was another slime bucket. Now, he arranged an abortion. Now, there's a he said, she said, Dr. Singer, who eventually is convicted, maintains his innocence throughout. He brings up some valid points, but all in all, it really looks like he's the one that did it. So basically, Ovalle arranges through a plastic surgeon named Dr. Glassberg, who was Polish and came to the U.S. via Vienna and France. I mean, they really lived in an international circle. Was a highfalutin plastic surgeon, and he supposedly said that he could arrange for a doctor whose name he did not want to give to perform the abortion. He said the price was going to be $2,000. So Eduardo, on October 16th, gives Ovalle $1,000 in $100 bills. The next day, he drops Jane off along with another $900 cash and a check for $100. Ovalle, being the slime bag he is, tells Glassberg that Eduardo was only willing to pay $1,000, hands over the $900 cash and a $100 check. Glassberg, not being an idiot, doesn't want to be caught with this check, gives it back to Ovalle, and he passes along 500 of it to Dr. Singer. So this is part of why I believe what Ovalle said, because he had no reason to implicate himself as being quite the scumbucket that he was, where he collected this $2,000 abortion fee in 1947, so this was quite a bit of money, and then skimmed off 1,100 of it. So throughout the month of October, they had worked with Ovalle to arrange this abortion. And on Friday the 17th, Eduardo picked Jane up at the Park Avenue apartment where she lived with her family. She said goodbye to her dad, said she was going to spend the weekend with friends in Long Island. She seemed perfectly fine when she left. The timeline gets a little bit muddled. It's really unclear what time Jane was dropped off at Glassberg's office where Ovalle met her. Eduardo just dropped her off. He just dumped her and left. What a scumbucket. Oh, she had wanted to marry him. He says, oh, I have a wife in Argentina and I can't divorce her. Later on, he says, oh, Jane knew I was married. I think if Jane knew he was married, she'd have wanted to deal with the pregnancy a little bit sooner than September if she started suspecting she was pregnant in July. Well, he drops Jane off. Ovalle meets her. They go in, and then they run to catch a taxi, which is important because later on Singer says that the abortion had been performed elsewhere before 6 p.m. There's no way she would have been able to run and catch a taxi with the injuries that she had suffered. At any rate, he said, she said, he said, she said. The one thing we know for sure is that Jane was probably in perfectly good health when she walked into Singer's office. She collapsed while she was there. Singer, instead of calling an ambulance, he says he tried to revive her. He splashed cold water in her face. Nothing. He used smelling salts. Nothing. He gave her an injection of one stimulant. Nothing. Gave her an injection of another stimulant. She opened her eyes and moaned, but wasn't really responsive. So instead of calling an ambulance, I mean, they're a couple of blocks from the hospital. They're easily walking distance of the hospital. Does he call an ambulance? Does he take her straight to the hospital? No, he calls Glassberg. Now, Glassberg shows up, and everybody agrees that about 9 p.m., both the doorman, the building superintendent, and the superintendent's wife saw two men carrying Jane's inert body out and dumping it in a car like a sack of potatoes. The building superintendent and his wife went over and asked one of the men what's happening. They said, no, nothing happening. Apparently, it's confusing whether they knew who Dr. Singer was or not. They later said that they didn't raise a big hue and cry because they figured Singer was a doctor. He knew what he was doing. Singer got in the driver's seat, drove the 5 minutes to the hospital with Jane. Glassberg walked there. Now, I do have to give Singer some credit for this. He does say he called Park East Hospital and asked Miss Anderson, who was on duty that night, to arrange an operating room for an emergency laparotomy for a ruptured ectopic pregnancy, which there's no way he would have thought it was that, even if she'd had the abortion somewhere else, if you were just looking at her symptoms. This was obviously serious injuries, and she was 5 months pregnant. So he calls, he asks to have universal blood ready for transfusion and to have the operating room ready for surgery. He gets there. He is in a really pissy mood because things are not readily available. They arrive at 9:35 p.m. The operating room is not ready until 9:40 p.m. when the instruments are sterilized, the OR's prepped, Jane's given some plasma, a scrub nurse, another nurse, an anesthetist, the house physician, and a resident physician scrub up along with Singer and Glassberg. At 10:15 p.m., the anesthetist starts administering anesthesia. Jane was already in shock with no pulse or blood pressure, and they did not have blood on hand yet at this point. Now, This is going to sound really awful to most people, but I'm going to tell you this is typical for a botched 5-month abortion where you attempt to take the baby out in pieces. This is not, oh my God, this was an illegal abortion. I've seen this again and again and again. Glassberg and Singer open up Jane's abdomen. There's about 1.5 quarts of blood with at least one fetal part, I believe the head, floating in it. They remove that, they suction out the blood, they find 2 more pieces of fetus, they take that out. There is a tear in the lining of her abdomen and another tear in the supporting structure of her small intestine. Now, Goldblatt is keeping Singer up to date on how Jane's doing. She is not doing well. Singer attempts to stitch up the damage to the supporting structure of Jane's small intestine. His sutures keep breaking, and the instruments that he would need to do a bowel resection would have to be sterilized, which would take almost an hour for some reason to prep that. So he decides that he's just going to close her up and hope for the best. And Goldblatt, the anesthetist, said that Jane was the deadest person he had ever seen leave an operating table. So Singer meets Ovale, who runs into the hospital, gets hold of Glassberg. Glassberg is going back and forth giving them updates, tells them Jane's going to survive, but they need to come up with a story. They come up with a story that Eduardo was taking Jane to Long Island to visit her friend. She started feeling ill. She said, let's go back to the city. She didn't want to go to her family doctor. So he asked Ovale to recommend somebody. Ovale contacted Glassberg, who contacted Singer, who said that Jane was almost collapsed when she got there and that she completely lost consciousness as he was putting her on the exam table. Now, like I said, he didn't call an ambulance. That's about the fishiest thing. So many doctors were present. It was so obviously a botched abortion. They do contact the police. The police investigate. The 4 men involved are all arrested. Now, at some point, Eduardo, I think it's the next morning, Eduardo tells Jane's father and brother that Singer had done the abortion. Jane's father insists on Singer being taken off the case, but Singer keeps going into Jane's room, and Jane's family keeps chasing him out. And Jane's father notes that Singer is the only doctor who did not send him a bill for Jane's care, which he finds kind of fishy, especially since he's the one that performed this complex emergency surgery. So the police started investigating. Jane died on October 27th. And during the grand jury testimony, all 4 men tell the same story that, the drive to Long Island, she gets sick. The day after Eduardo testifies to the grand jury, the cops take him into custody and he changes his story. And that's when he said he arranged the abortion with Ovale. Once he spills his guts, Ovale spills his guts. Singer and Glassberg insist that no, they were just patching up an abortion that somebody else botched. But like I said, I really think it was Singer who did it, especially since why would Ovale and Eduardo implicate themselves, and why would Jane's father take Singer off the case after he talked to Eduardo? The first trial was declared a mistrial because while the autopsy was being described, and in the autopsy they found 3 or 4 more parts of the baby. They described the autopsy. One of the jurors passed out. All parties agreed on a mistrial. They decided that the next time they were going to check and make sure all the jurors had strong stomachs. Second trial ends up with a hung jury. Third trial, Singer is convicted. And then, Singer and Glassberg are convicted. On the day that they are sentenced, Singer breaks down, Glassberg seems very calm, commits suicide by poisoning himself in his jail cell. Singer appealed, and that's all that documentation I have that I'm reading through, where it becomes really clear how muddled the timeline is. Um, Singer got a bunch of people to testify that Jane could have lived for hours before she passed out with the injuries that she had. There is no freaking way she could have been walking around and perfectly ambulatory for several hours with these injuries. It's just, it it boggles belief. So eventually, Singer was sentenced to 2.5 to 5 years for manslaughter. Glassberg, of course, is dead. Ovale eventually, he had a trial, but for some reason he decided he was just going to go ahead and plead guilty, and I think he was sentenced to 1 year. The only person who didn't seem to suffer from this was good old Eduardo, who the judge just reamed up one side and down the other, but for some reason, maybe because he was some high-ranking Argentine dude, he was not only not prosecuted, from what I can tell, he wasn't even deported. So, um, this kind of brings up for me some of the issues with abortion being illegal. Not in terms of the injuries that Jane sustained, because, like I said, they're fairly typical of a botched abortion at that stage. Mangled fetus being pushed through a hole in the uterus into the abdominal cavity. In fact, her bowel was a lot less mangled than a lot of cases I've seen. Um, I'm not quite sure why Singer didn't go in and patch up the bowel after Jane seemed to recover. Oh, and one of the things that Singer appealed on the grounds of, his lawyer allowed the uterus that was removed during the hysterectomy, the fetal parts, and the damaged portion of Jane's intestines to be not only admitted as evidence, but sent to the jury room. And he's like, there's no way they were going to acquit me with that stuff sitting there. So I think that Jane likely would have suffered the same injuries and died the same horrible death if her abortion had been legal. She probably still would have gone to Singer, this Park Avenue gynecologist. He got a lot of hoity-toity people to be character witnesses for him. The thing is, the investigation into what happened. Um, but then I see that when Abu, the butcher of Avenue A, Hyatt, who was a National Abortion Federation member, botched an abortion causing the death of a 17-year-old girl. He also denied that she had ever been a patient of his. So this, I don't know, never saw her in my life, that persists even after legalization. But it's something certainly where I would be open to having a discussion with pro-choice people about, what effect do you think the legal status of abortion had on how Jane suffered versus how women in the safe and legal era suffer. And what can we do, whether abortion is legal or not, to help women first of all, to help women avoid these injuries, and second of all, to help the families when this happens.